There was something distinct about Eastern Europe. History was alive there. Part of the thing with Eastern Europe is that you're juggling 20 countries, 20 different histories. There was really a difference on the other side. When you go from America to Poland, you're crossing this huge boundary, especially in the 80s, but you just like a different smell, a different texture, different way of life. My grandfather's building was pockmarked with bullet holes from World War II.
They say something like, "Oh, sweet mother of God, we're in Eastern Europe." Welcome to the Interlocutor podcast. I'm Tyrell Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Jacob Mikanowski. Jacob is an American writer and historian with a specialization in the history of Eastern Europe. As a journalist, he writes about art, books, movies, ancient history, anthropology, and the relationship between the humanities and science. Today he joins me for a discussion about his book called Goodbye Eastern Europe, An Intimate History of a Divided Land. Jacob, it's a pleasure to speak to you today. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I learned from your background that your parents are Polish and they moved to the United States, or they went to the United States in the 1980s. Where did they end up finding a place to live there, and what were the circumstances that brought them to the United States?
You know, it's a little funny. They came to the United States separately. They grew up both in Warsaw, actually a couple blocks from each other, very close, but didn't know each other. Did know some people in common. They didn't go to the same high school, but grew up in the exact same little neighborhood, very central neighborhood in Warsaw. They came to the United States separately. My dad was on a student visa as a kind of an academic exchange, supposed to be there for 9 months. A grad student who's working on something and was invited over. And my mom came for 6 weeks to visit her aunt who was living in Queens. New York, and then they met in Cambridge, Massachusetts, through some friends of theirs. Mm-hmm. They came. They intended to stay just for that summer and fall. But while they were in Poland, while they were in America, martial law was declared in Poland, which was an incredibly dramatic event at the time, December 1981, where solidarity had been going on for a few months, over a year. This huge grassroots movement protesting and organizing against communist power, and then in one night, the kind of communist government tried to decapitate and shut down this giant 10 million person strong movement. So they arrested 6,000 people all in one night, cut all the telephone lines, cut all the phone lines, same thing I guess, closed the country, no traffic in or out, no one exiting, no one leaving, no one coming in. So it seemed, after a few months, I think it was possible to go back, but it seemed unwise. Anyone who was abroad, stayed abroad. Anyone who could get out, tried to get out. Most people tried to get out later in 84, 85, 86. If they could, they left. But my parents were kind of marooned in America. They didn't expect to move. They didn't know English. They knew very little English. And I was born about a little over 9 months later, and grew up in a very Polish kind of cultural household. And then started going back as soon as it became possible. So I started going back when I was, I think, 4 years old. So I remember the Poland of kind of the end of socialism, 86, 87, 88. Lived there in 93, lived there in 2002, 2010. So that's kind of the short story.
Did those early trips to Poland when you were young, when it was still during the communist times, did that shape the way that you see Poland or Europe or the United States today at all?
Very much. It was a fascinating experience. I was growing up, I grew up in central Pennsylvania. It's kind of not close to anything, college town between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, kind of like a suburban town, but with no city, just trees and dairy farms around. Everything built after 1945, really everything built after 1970, kind of a historyless, pleasant, green place. And then you go to Poland, and history was alive there. My grandfather's building was pockmarked with bullet holes from World War II, which he had fought in, which he would tell stories about, the March in Berlin, or being in Siberia during the war. He had most of Warsaw was leveled in World War II, but about 10-15% is pre-war construction, and often you see these pockmarked bullet holes. So you'd go there, and history was right on the surface. It's very exciting, very dynamic history, and then it was also happening in front of your eyes. I was there as communism fell. I was there during the kind of 1991 putsch in Russia, where people were now kind of forgotten at the time, but people thought it was coming back. This very scary moment. It made a huge impression on me as a child. And it was the very chaotic beginnings of capitalism. I was there kind of during hyperinflation. I was going to elementary school when the very kind of roughest part of the transition, when millions of people were suddenly out of work, the currency was bottoming out. Poland now is this kind of the, people talk about the Polish tiger. It's probably the best economy in Europe. It's probably the most dynamic recent success story of the Eastern Bloc. But in the 90s, none of that was true. You just have this other side of the Vistula, this giant market where thousands of people were coming from the former Soviet Union, coming from Bulgaria, coming from the Balkans, coming all the way from the Koreas to trade whatever they had on hand, whatever goods they were getting from factories that were shutting down. I started buying Soviet military hardware, like telescope, like fancy binoculars you could get really cheap. You get cool minerals. There's stuff that you get a cool coat, stuff you could get even as a kid. But this very dynamic, and that really stayed with me. That sense that when you would go from America to Poland, you were really crossing this huge boundary, especially in the 80s. But you just like a different smell, a different texture, a different way of life. And that there was really a difference on the other side of first crossing the invisible Berlin Wall border, and then crossing this kind of into a different Europe. And I spent some little time in Western Europe too, in Paris, Berlin. We visited people. My parents had some friends living in Denmark. That's very different. It's very, very different. That sense you don't get as much anymore of of crossing into a totally different kind of living.
Was it difficult to cross back and forth? Your parents were citizens of Poland, and their roots are there. How were they able to just go back and forth the way that they did?
For a while, actually, my dad had problems. When I was a kid, my dad did have there were visa issues, and it was actually a headache. Even going to Canada was a problem. My mom had U.S. relatives, and her green card was kind of more secure. My dad had a pretty solid job early on. He in college studied kind of obscure subject in mathematics. He was a mathematician, and he got into logic, and then he got into this field that no one had ever heard of called algorithms, theory of algorithms, that turned out to be useful. People didn't know it in the 80s. Turns out you can do a lot of things with algorithms. Back then, when he was doing stuff with punch cards on a Polish mainframe, it seemed, I think, pretty pie in the sky. But he had a pretty good teaching job. But actually, in the 80s, there were some problems. I was actually old enough to remember it. And they got sorted out by the Reagan amnesty. Some of your listeners will be surprised. Under Ronald Reagan, there was a quote-unquote amnesty for different kinds of Visa green card holders that improved a lot of people's immigration status. Hard to imagine now with what's going on. But actually, my understanding is that helped things out a lot.
You mentioned in the book that you had this cigar box that belonged to your grandfather, and it was full of these rough orange pebbles of raw amber that he had gathered with your father on Polish beaches. What is the story of this cigar box and that was full of these amber pebbles? Tell us about the land and history of that area.
I wish I could tell you more about the cigar box. I remember what it looked like. But the gist of that is my dad and grandfather, like very many Poles, would go to the shore, the Baltic coast, and whenever there's a storm up on that southern shore of the Baltic, you can find naturally occurring amber. It is one of the great amber locations in the world. The biggest Denmark also has some. The biggest concentration historically is in the Kaliningrad Oblast, what used to be East Prussia, that little piece of Russia that's wedged in between Poland and Lithuania. That's actually prime. That's the most prime amber territory. You can actually mine tons of amber, and they do. But going back to Roman times, going back probably to the Bronze Age and earlier, people would pick up pieces of amber on the beach because they they wear out of the cliffs, they wear out of the sand, or mine it in little pits. And that's what this area was known for. It's the Amber Coast. That's what was kind of its role in the wider European world, was that, you know, if Romans or Greeks or people in the Middle East wanted amber, that's where it would come from. The Amber Road led up from Vienna and went north to around, we actually don't know for sure, but somewhere on that southern Baltic coast. And that's kind of the beginning of when people became aware distantly of that territory that we now call Eastern Europe, but back then it's kind of like beyond the Danube, north and east, and it's amber that kind of put it on the map.
There's a poet named, and forgive the pronunciation, Czesław Miłosz, the author of A Captive Mind. He eventually moved to the United States and taught at the University of California, Berkeley. This is also where you did your dissertation work. Was he the reason you chose to go there?
Actually, no.
No.
It's a little bit the other way around, is that being in Berkeley pushed me to writing about Miłosz. My dissertation is heavily on Miłosz. It maybe put a seed in it. I want to say that that's not completely true. I like the faculty at Berkeley. I love the city. I think some of the same things that drew Miłosz to the Bay. I think it's a beautiful place. I lived there over a decade and really loved it. It's actually being there that made me more interested in Miłosz, kind of by happenstance. I was living right, like, he had this house way up this, Berkeley's got these, it's on the east shore of the San Francisco Bay. It's got these hills that rise up above town. He lived almost at the top of the hill, looking out over San Francisco Bay. He has a collection of poems about that view of San Francisco Bay and other things. In California, I actually lived like 2 blocks from it used to be his house, and got a chance to have dinner there, actually totally by, not because of Polish things, not because of anything, because of someone knew somebody who was doing something, kind of small town things. And I knew people who had known him, and got more and more interested. And the more I read, the more I appreciated what an excellent poet he was, and what a deep kind of historical vision he had too. He's not just a poet; he's an excellent kind of social thinker, historian. His book Native Realm, if you want kind of a view of the what Eastern Europeanness is, that I really agree with and really resonate with, that's an excellent book to read, Native Realm. And actually recently I went to look for his Lithuanian roots. I also have roots in Lithuania. Actually kind of they intersect a little bit, his and mine, in kind of central Lithuania, and went on this road trip that went to where he was born back in 1911, and his the areas he lived in, you know, in the first decade of his life. It's all now Lithuania, what was Russian Empire before World War One, and then was kind of right on the line disputed between Lithuania and Poland. He actually writes about crossing the Green Border a lot of time, and found it really fascinating. But yeah, it is actually living in Berkeley that made me more interested in Miłosz than the other way around.
In 2004, this movie called Eurotrip came out, and it was about these 4 American teens finish high school and backpack around Europe, and they're trying to get to Berlin, and they're hitchhiking with some truck driver, and they end up in Bratislava. And when they realize this, they say something like, "Oh, sweet mother of God, we're in Eastern Europe." And there's Khrushchev-looking like apartment blocks, and women throwing raw sewage from a bucket off her balcony, really playing up this stereotype. And in 2013, I was visiting a friend in Slovakia, and we were just in conversation, and I, without any connotation, referred to Slovakia as Eastern Europe, and he casually and gently corrected me and said, no, Central Europe. And that was the first time I had ever heard that term or became aware that, that he didn't want Slovakia to be referred to as Eastern Europe. And when I was reading the opening pages of Goodbye Eastern Europe, you say there's no such place as Eastern Europe anymore. So why did my friend wish to be from Central Europe rather than Eastern Europe, in your view?
I think he's not alone at all. I think it's a very common sentiment, a very kind of a product of that, the wider mythos that Euro trip movie embodies. It's very funny. I think Bratislava is kind of the most sleepy, provincial, safe little town. I find it a very boring city. I like Slovakia a lot, but I don't like Bratislava, basically for the opposite reasons. I find it kind of too Viennese and buttoned up and dull. But that people have this perception of Eastern Europe as something dangerous, but also kind of morose and sad and kind of backwards, but stuck in this kind of communist past. And people perceive that very strongly in some places. I think especially former Czechoslovakia, so we have what's called the Visegrad Group. Former Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, a little less, but also Croatia, Slovenia. None of them want to carry the weight of the Eastern European label. They want to say Central Europe. And you'll have people very much correct you, insist on it, insist that Eastern Europe is an anachronism. And in other parts of Eastern Europe, what I call Eastern Europe, though few people in Eastern Europe call Eastern Europe, you'll find out like other versions in the Baltics, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, their attempts to rebrand themselves as Nordic countries. They're not quite in Scandinavia. Estonia very much has really kind of succeeded in that. Latvia and Lithuania a little less. Lithuania is really, for me, hard to see that as a real case. But the further north you go, it kind of does blur a little bit. In the Balkans, there are different kinds of ways of avoiding saying Eastern Europe, or even having East in that part. Eastern Adriatic, Black Sea region, anything to get rid of that label. People really have been fleeing it. And part of what I wanted to write in the book is I think it is vanishing from people's kind of mental landscape. People are escaping it. Governments are trying to get rid of it. But that there was something historically actually valuable, distinct about Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe doesn't have the same history that Western Europe does. It actually doesn't have the same history that Russia or Turkey or points east do. It has something, it's very diverse internally, but there's a certain kind of similarity in that diversity, and a similarity of experience, and actually something valuable that's not worth throwing out. You're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I'm kind of like, let's remember a little bit what was worth saving here. But yeah, I'm not surprised at all by your Slovak friend. I've heard the exact same thing. I've had people stand up in talks I've given and say like, no, there is no such thing. And that's part of the reason it's called Goodbye Eastern Europe, not Hello Eastern Europe.
What are archaeologists contributing to the story of Eastern European history, and before we have writing and stories and things recording this history?
That's a very interesting question, and I can only kind of speak to parts of it. And that's part of the thing with Eastern Europe, is that you're juggling 20 countries, 20 different histories. Part of what makes it distinct from the rest of Western Europe is that it kind of comes online historically later. There are very few written records pre about 1000 AD, or in 900 some places even a little later. There are parts of Eastern Europe kind of further south, the southmost, that were in the Roman Empire and that kind of had that history, and then dropped out as the barbarian invasions kind of separated them out, and then you have these Dark Age centuries where you don't totally know what's going on. Archaeology is opening a lot of that story, but not all of it. There are a lot of mysteries kind of in Eastern European history. One of them is, who are the Slavs? Where did they come from? Why is Slavic so uniform? Slavic languages aren't actually all that different, which is great for me because I speak pretty good Polish, and makes me feel like I can, and I studied Russian, and between those two, there isn't that much difference among the Slavic languages. Bulgarian to me sounds really strange. But there's a continuum, and something created that. Something kind of made the language more uniform before it split up and spread apart. And there are theories about what that was. There are tons of theories about where Slavs came from or how. There's a question of where the Hungarians came from and when. We kind of know when, but exactly who they were, what that was. And how these different states came into being. What was the origin of Poland? What was the origin of Bohemia before it was Czech Republic? When and how they started. The stories we have, the chronicles we have, are basically fanciful legends that then turn into sort of dynastic history. But they tell a story of origins, and it's honestly pure fairy tale. They're kind of funny. They have a sweetness. The archaeology tells a very different story. The kind of folkloric version that these medieval chronicles say, they're different, but they're usually a poor peasant boy gets visited by somebody important, some kind of magical figure, and told that they should become king. This person from the common, a little bit of King Arthur and Excalibur, but on a kind of humbler scale. The real story looks much darker. You can kind of see why they didn't want to put it in. It looks like the thing that, after amber was the commodity that linked northern Eastern Europe to the Mediterranean, to the rest of Europe. In the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, when you're starting to get these countries that we know of forming, the commodity that people were really after, a little bit furs, a little bit amber, the main one was slaves. That word slave comes from Slav, because that was your typical slave in Europe around the year 800, 900, 1000 was a Slav, and they were also being shipped to the Islamic world. Hungary was a nomadic empire, but they were also trading slaves, kind of a nomadic kingdom, and Rus, the parent entity behind what's now Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, but back then really a series of river ports that transshipped slaves and some other goods, but mainly slaves. That was the big thing. And we now have evidence of that in the archaeology. We have shackles, camps, but especially the stuff they got back in return, the dirhams, the silver that's scattered all across northern Eastern Europe, buried because they were selling people for hard currency. And it looks like Scandinavians and people teaming up with Scandinavians locally and then marrying them was a big story of state formation in Eastern Europe. And there are a lot of other things that archaeology has shed light on. Some things not enough. You would think that there like Slavic paganism, almost no trace in archaeology, and even what was thought to be dubious. It seems like it was a religion or a faith that was done almost all outdoors. So there are really no temples, almost no effigies. There's one awesome counterexample in Krakow, which keen watchers of the North. Did you see the Norseman? The movie?
I haven't. No.
Yeah, it actually shows up. No. There's some cool Slavic details. It's a movie with very good mise en scène, very good. All the details in that movie are very interesting. But that's the long and short of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why did paganism? You mentioned that earlier. Why did paganism last so long in that region? And then how did Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism start to influence the development of this region?
Paganism lasted a really long time in Eastern Europe, partly because it was far, the center of Christianity in Europe was the Mediterranean. The further you got away from it, the longer it took. Ireland's the weird counterexample, where they got it early and then started spreading it to Germany. Ireland was this incubator of Christianity. But Eastern Europe falls in the same pattern as Scandinavia, as Russia, as really only comes online to Christianity around the year 1000. I'm going to turn the light on. We're losing daylight here. I'm going to turn the light on. So distance is part of it. But then there's one kind of remarkable And then around the year 1000, almost every country adopts Christianity, either Catholic or Orthodox. And there's one big counterexample, Lithuania. Lithuania is now a pretty small country, pretty neat country. I have Lithuanian roots. I like visiting there. But there was a Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which is really enormous in comparison to today's standards. It included Lithuania, today's Lithuania, a lot of Latvia, most of Belarus, parts of today's Poland, parts of Ukraine. It was one of the bigger states in Europe around 1300, and it was pagan. Its ruling class was proudly pagans. At the same time, the Renaissance is just starting in Florence. What's happening is like Edward III in England, like high Middle Ages, high pomp of like the militant church, and the Crusades are all basically over. And you're building all the great medieval cathedrals, and in this Lithuanian empire, it's ruled by pagan dukes, and they were actually kind of like semi-tolerant, but every once in a while a Dominican or a kind of Menican friar would get on their nerves and they'd toss them on a fire. Or they were also fighting these German crusaders who were fighting for the faith, but also just expanding this territory of the Teutonic Knights. And they would disembowel them, they would burn them. There was a really nasty war that went on for hundreds of years between the Lithuanian pagans and the German knights. Kind of okay relationships with the Poles who were Catholic, but pragmatic also. So you have this, and until the end of the 14th century almost, it's the last bastion of organized European paganism. And partly because they are threatened by these militant crusading Catholics, they kind of organize in response to that. Some of them are converted and wiped out. The original Prussians were actually pagan Baltic people, which now doesn't exist anymore. They had their own language similar to Latvian and Lithuanian, and they all became Germanified, and that's where East Prussia came from. But the Lithuanians, the other side of the border, the more the Crusaders pushed, the more they pushed back with their paganism. So that it became kind of counterproductive, and eventually they converted to have a strategic alliance with Poland against the Crusaders. They both kind of got something out of it for political reasons, not maybe deep spiritual ones.
A quote from your book said that about 80% of Jews alive today can trace their ancestry back to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This seems to be quite an amazing fact. What's the story of how that came to be?
It's also a little bit mysterious. We know some of the details, but some are missing. It's actually kind of a little called the Polish-Jewish demographic puzzle. But the broad strokes of it are, as the Middle Ages go on, and it's also the story of how Eastern Europe becomes different from Western Europe. As the Middle Ages go on, and you have the church militant in Western Europe, you get more organized state, like centralized states in Western Europe, and the centralized states use the kind of combined power of king and church to become ever more homogenous, to basically kick out the Jews and kick out the Muslims. In Portugal and Spain and Italy, they push out, convert, and expel Muslims. All those countries expel Jews. And England's kind of the first in the 12th century, and then France, and then parts of Germany, and then finally Spain in 1492. And as those Western European countries are kicking out Jews, especially, they tend to go east. The ones from Spain, a lot of them go south to Morocco and Turkey. But the ones from Western Europe, they keep going east. So from England to France, from France to Germany, and from Germany to the east. And Eastern European countries kind of have the reverse. They have a lot of land, but not a lot of people. They have very few cities and very few towns, and they need merchants, they need craftspeople, they need soldiers, they need manpower. And in search of manpower, they recruit those minorities that the Western Europeans are kicking out. In Hungary and in Poland-Lithuania, they bring in nomadic Muslim usually Muslim, even pagan. In Hungary's case, Kumans, are kind of equestrian people, horseback riding nomads to serve as military auxiliaries. And for kind of craft trade specialties, they bring in German miners, a lot of them, Germans, and Jews. So eventually, Poland-Lithuania is also a big country. Its towns, its rural countryside was mostly Christian, and often Orthodox, even when it was run by Catholics. But the towns were heavily Jewish. The towns were populated by a large population of kind of petty craftspeople. And that's kind of where my family's half Jewish. Exactly that kind of world of cobblers, millers, petty traders, shop owners, furriers, all the kinds of things that you need in a small town. And Poland really recruited that. Poland-Lithuania is a kind of joint kingdom, like England and Scotland. And they recruited a lot, and they thrived there, and the population grew and grew and grew. And then most Russian Jews, not all Russian Jews, but the majority of Russian Jews are Russian because Russia took over the larger piece of Poland-Lithuania. So if you go back, most Russian Jews also trace back to Poland-Lithuania. Before Russia took over Poland, took over most of eastern Poland at the end of the 18th century, in the 1770s and 80s, there were very few Jews in Russia. And the ones that were tended to be like little pockets in the south, in the Caucasus and in Crimea, much more of a Sephardic type of Jew, which isn't the kind of standard Russian Jew. So you have this, and actually going back also, Hungary, places next to Poland-Lithuania, were often settled by Jews, leaving the overcrowding in these small Polish towns. So it became the real incubator of European Jewry.
That partly, or actually mostly, answers another question I had. Madame Marie Curie, the famous scientist, was born in 1867. Her name at birth was Maria Sklodowska. Hopefully I said that close to correct. And she went to this private school for girls when she was a kid, and the Russian authorities would come to her school, and the teacher would call on her to answer the questions in Russian because she could speak it and was a brilliant kid. The inspector would be satisfied and go away. Then they'd go back to learning like Polish history rather than Russian history. So why were the inspectors, at a school like that, monitoring what they were learning?
So Poland was partitioned in the 18th century between three empires. Kind of Imperial Germany, the Berlin Germany, Austro-Hungary, the capital Vienna, Habsburgs, and Russia of the Tsars got the biggest piece, including Warsaw. And that wasn't it was a meal that they couldn't digest. Poland kept rebelling. Poles in Russia kept rebelling. They rebelled right after they were taken over in the 1790s. They rebelled again in 1830. They rebelled a third time in 1863. Actually, my great-great-grandfather lost his arm in that rebellion. Had it amputated after being shot in some battle somewhere. And after that last rebellion, the Russians are really like, okay, this is enough of you guys. They clamped down very severely for the last kind of 30 years of the 19th century, 35 years. They sent a lot of people to Siberia. And then they had this real drive to try and Russify the population. They're like, because previously there were different kinds of autonomy for the Polish part. It was run a little differently and had a little different laws. It actually had its own currency. It was part of the Russian Empire, but you could use Polish in different parts. Finland was run kind of like that. Finland was in the Russian Empire, but it was always kind of run differently. The Russian Empire was very complicated. It was this big patchwork, and different parts of it were run kind of on different lines. And then after this last rebellion, bloody rebellion, same time as the American Civil War, they're like, okay, no more Polish schools, no more Polish language, no more Polish anything. Anything public is going to be Russian, and we're going to try and Russify as much as possible. So high schools were supposed to be in Russian. And that's the Marie Sklodowska story. That's the story you see in other people's, where you have to Polish education was driven underground, Lithuanian actually too. And then Ukrainian, they started cracking down on Ukrainian, kind of for the similar reasons. All these nationalisms of their kind of the western side of Russia, so if you switch it, Eastern Europe, but west to Russia, they really start cracking down on the 19th century and trying to suppress local language, suppress local religion, and try and make things integrated as much into a single idea of Russia as possible. Where before, at the start, they actually were more open to difference. There were more different kinds of ways things were run, and as long as you were obedient to the Tsar, as long as you weren't politically standing up, you could be culturally distinct. But once that late 19th century kicks in, really no. And so that the memory of that is very fresh still in Poland. 150 years later, of course, it was renewed by the Cold War and by Soviet presence post 45. But there's this deeper trauma of Russification really got under Poles' skin.
There's a term called Bohemian, describes somebody, I guess, from a region of the Czech Republic, Bohemia, but it also means someone who is socially unconventional or artistic. How does this term get associated with that kind of person?
That's a great question, and it's La Bohème and La Vie Bohème, and because Bohemia is kind of the Czech Republic has two historical regions, Bohemia and Moravia, and Bohemia is the bigger one. It's where Prague is, and the kind of original kingdom is the Kingdom of Bohemia, which had its heyday in the Middle Ages, and then Bohemians, I'm not sure why, that's like a Parisian story, and I'm not positive. I don't know. It's a strange one.
I read once that Kafka was born in Prague and his family was from a village in the Czech Republic. He grew up speaking German. Is that because it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire at that time?
I believe so, yeah. He spent most of his short life, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire when Prague was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He died in the 20s, so he lived a few years in Czechoslovakia. The Jewish community of Prague was mostly German-speaking. And a lot of the Jews in Greater Austria, it's a complicated term, were German-speaking, even if they were surrounded by non-German speakers. So Austro-Hungary had two halves, the Hungarian half and the Austrian half. And actually, that Austrian half included most of what's now Czech Republic, Slovenia, not Slovakia. Slovakia was the Hungarian half. Southern Poland, Austria, part of Croatia. And the Jews there usually spoke German. There's a big Jewish community in Prague, quite kind of a prosperous, pretty well-to-do one, and they were mostly German-speaking. And that's also the situation in the Czech lands, where they were really split, not quite 50-50, but Czech-speaking majority, but very large German-speaking minority. Partly because part of the Czech lands were heavily kind of German. That's the Sudeten land that then Hitler annexes. And then pockets all over kind of just what we would call Germans. Sudeten Germans and other Germans. And the minorities, because German was the language of administration, language of science, language of education, language of the professions, law, medicine. Jews gravitated towards it. So most Prague Jews pre-1918 were almost always German-speaking. They might also speak Yiddish or Hebrew. Not Hebrew so much, but Yiddish and German. In other parts of Eastern Europe, that was much less common, but like in southern Poland, it kind of went both ways. People would know both. And in northern Poland, Lithuania, be no German at all, but Yiddish, which has, is really kind of a very kind of transmogrified German dialect. Most of its vocabulary, kind of cultural vocabulary, derives from German.
In Japan, where I live, it's possible to go to a production of Fiddler on the Roof and watch it in Japanese. And I'm wondering how familiar you are with the play and how you see the themes of that story relating to, I guess, the overall story that you've told in Goodbye Eastern Europe.
There is a little aspect of it that, that it goes back. Shalom Aleichem was also kind of writing in an elegiac mode almost, so for the Yiddish kind of Jewish world of his youth. And I'm kind of writing, a lot of the book is trying to go back to kind of the world of my great-grandparents and grandparents. Mm-hmm. There's something kind of perceptive in that story about the different tracks that were available to Eastern European Jews, kind of circa 1910, 1914. Mm-hmm. Where the daughters, I think one goes to America, one goes to Palestine, and one stays at home. I forget if there's one who becomes a revolutionary. But that's kind of true in my family, is that a whole branch of my family, kind of long lost, although they actually found us at one point, but a bunch of my mom's great aunts and uncles. There was this most of them left in 1912, went to Baltimore on a ship, the way a lot of Eastern European Jews went to America, and then the pattern usually was there'd be like a bunch of siblings, 8 or 9 siblings, and the oldest would stay. And I am descended from that oldest, Mikanowski, because the oldest son would take over the family business, take over whatever thing they had going usually, and all the younger siblings would look for opportunity in America. And then my dad's side of the family, my grandfather's cousins went to Israel in the 30s. One was Palestine. They were labor Zionists, very kind of, learning Hebrew, hoping to work the land, have kibbutzes. Actually, my grandfather's cousin had a kibbutz. So these are people who left Poland in the 30s. Well, I had met some of them in the 90s. Because my grandfather, when he was finally able to travel after 50 years of communism, went and met people he hadn't seen in probably since 36, 37. So that was another path. America, Palestine. And then, radical, like leaving kind of that Orthodox Jewish, kind of very closed world that my grandfather actually grew up in, going to Heder, speaking Yiddish, learning, being mostly instructed in Talmud and religion. He became a kind of, actually both my grandfathers were young communists. Teenage, joined the party or weren't allowed to join the party until they were adults, but started that kind of things when it was illegal. It was illegal in Poland, but it was attractive to a lot of Jews, actually a lot of Ukrainians and Belarusians, because it addressed inequality and discrimination within Poland. And that was true in a lot of Eastern Europe too. That kind of like radical leftist politics addressed the inequalities within those countries. And people didn't necessarily know what was going on in the Soviet Union. In fact, they really didn't know. It was actually pretty shocking when they went during the war. They're like, oh wow, this isn't what we imagined. But that kind of, communism back then, it seemed like you were against the fascists, and the fascists were very real. It's Mussolini and Hitler's in power, and you're protesting these, very real structures of discrimination because there was not equal rights for everyone. So the ethnic minorities, religious minorities in Poland, in Hungary, Czechoslovakia was actually pretty good, but even there, needed a way to redress their wrongs. And that was one of them. There's a book called The Jewish Century. He kind of uses that framework of the daughters, of Tevye's daughters, to see the paths that Jews could and did take across the 20th century. So there's a little bit of that. That's not I'm from the very few that stay in Eastern Europe, a very small minority that gets through the war, and then a very small minority of that minority that stays after the 50s and 60s, and only leaves in the 80s. So that's kind of an odd pathway, but it's a real one. It's just a minority one.
Picking up on that, Interested in your take on the communities in Poland or say some of the surrounding countries. After the Second World War, the Jewish people who survived, at least from having their lives ended, in many cases didn't have a place to go back to, at least a home that they were welcome in. A lot of them sort of became persona non grata. I'm interested in your background because your ancestors did stay in that region. So
there's actually a real kind of difference between the countries that were in the Soviet Union and the countries that weren't. So I'll be kind of maybe talking about Poland, because people who were in the Soviet Union, a lot more Jews survived in the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, of course, expanded to include Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, Moldova, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and people who were there were kind of in the Soviet Union for good, at least until the 70s. Eastern Europe, outside of the Soviet Union, was a different story. It worked very differently. The Holocaust was devastating, but hundreds of thousands of people did survive. So in Poland, about 300,000 out of about 3.3 million, roughly. And a lot of them came back. And their homes are often destroyed or occupied by other people, or if they did go back, they faced violence. For a few years, a lot of people actually settled in what in Poland are called the reclaimed lands. It's a loaded term, but that's the part of Germany that's now part of Poland. That's kind of Poland, after the war, lost its eastern territories, but then kind of moved west and took a big bite out of what used to be Germany. So Wrocław, Szczecin, Zielona Góra, there's kind of this belt of what had been Germany, which became Poland, is still Poland. And a lot of people moved there. There was like a kind of Yiddish-speaking community, there was Yiddish press. But as communism really ramped up in the 40s, people weren't into it, and they left. A lot of people left between 45 and 48. That's actually the most common thing. That's the biggest chunk of that. You're going down from 3 million to 300,000 to a couple tens of thousands in the 50s and 60s. And the people who stay usually had pretty good jobs or positions somehow connected to the government. Actually, the government is essentially the main employer in the entire country, unless you have a small land holding. Even then, it's usually nationalized. And some people stayed. Some people made lives for themselves, and then things really closed. You could not leave for a lot of the 50s. It was just prohibited. And then in the latest 50s, early 60s, Stalin's dead. Things loosen up, and things open up a little bit, and then a lot of people start leaving if they can. And then in 68, there's a kind of like anti-Semitic drive. It's complicated. The story has in 68, but part of internal maneuvering within the Polish Communist Party, there's a real push to expel the remaining Jews in the country. There are about 20,000 left. And that's when the last kind of a larger piece of that Polish Jewish world leaves. A lot of them left for Scandinavia. And those people are in Sweden, Denmark, Lamay. That happened when my mom was like in middle school. And a lot of her friends kind of left that summer. My parents didn't leave for kind of personal reasons. Because their parents were they were both intermarried with Polish women, Catholic women, who didn't want to leave. In my dad's case, there was actually pretty high. My dad's dad was pretty high up in the military, and maybe wasn't going to be allowed to leave, so that wasn't a question. And my mom's dad, who was also a party member in the war and was in the Red Army, the intelligence things, he was dead. He died of stomach cancer in the early 60s, and she had a Polish mom who didn't want to leave, so they stayed. And then a couple thousand people. Usually, like me, like half or less, sometimes a little more. But it's you have that winnowing from millions to hundreds of thousands to tens of thousands to, you'll see all kinds of estimates about Poland, like 5 to 10,000. I think it's less, depending on how you count, depending what self-identification you use. In other parts of Eastern Europe, it's a little different. There are a lot more Jews in Hungary. they had kind of a different experience of the Holocaust. Extremely devastating in most of the country, but not as bad in Budapest. Was the kind of exact circumstances of how it worked in the few weeks when it was kind of a devastating summer when most people were killed, but there's a kind of compared to Poland, a larger group that's there and still there and very Hungarian. And then in different countries, Czechoslovakia is a little bit like Poland. Yugoslavia is very different Jewish world there, kind of half Sephardic, half Ashkenazi. Other countries Albania had almost no Jews to begin with. So I don't want to generalize too much, but that's kind of the overall picture.
Mm-hmm. So I have one more question about war, and then I'd like to talk in our last couple of questions about travel and maybe some more positive things. But I want to ask, how has the recent war in Ukraine changed Ukraine's relationship to its neighbors, Belarus, Poland, Hungary, Romania, these different neighbors, Slovakia as well?
Well, interestingly, it's changed it in different directions with different neighbors. It's drawn it very close to Poland and the Baltic countries, who see Ukraine's struggle as their own, who see Ukraine as fighting their fight for them, who help it enormously. Poland gives more per capita than any European country of military aid, similar to the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, very much kind of militantly on Ukraine's side, very much the leading voices in Europe arguing for help with Ukraine. Belarus, absolutely not. But traditionally, there's no animosity between Belarus and Ukraine. They're both Orthodox. They kind of have no territorial ambitions against each other. Their people were both kind of in the bigger Poland-Lithuania matrix and then the Russian Empire, and they had no beef. They both kind of faced the same problems from the big boot of Russia and the smaller boot of Poland on kind of the western side. But now politically, absolutely opposites, because Lukashenko is an absolute tool of Putin, and very unpopular at home. Kind of crushed a kind of student and voter protest movement against him, and knows that to stay in power, he has to rely on Russian strength. So he is, at the same time, I don't think he's eager to fight Ukraine directly, but has to knuckle under and do what is essentially political masters want. So kind of strange situation where it's not any kind of deep animosity, but they are on opposite sides of a conflict. Hungary, officially, very much against Ukraine and talking about dismembering. Orban is part of this axis with Putin and with now Trump, and maybe the Italians, maybe the Serbians, but probably definitely the most pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian, most vocally and kind of directly anti in the European Union, does everything he can to scuttle any kind of collective action. Serbia, but now Serbia is in turmoil, but Serbia has been very much against Ukraine, pro-Putin. And on the flip side, Serbia's enemies are on the other side of it. So you have these like nested animosities. It's brought actually Serbia and Hungary kind of close together, and they've traditionally been rivals. Romania's been pro-Ukraine, but now is facing the election of a far-right government, which probably will be anti. So you have a dynamic situation of flip-flopping alliances with this core of Poland and the Baltics, and really Czech Republic too, Czechia, of being very kind of staunchly pro-Ukraine. Slovakia, another flip-flopper though. They kind of, like America, have this kind of centrist government and then the far-right government, and flip-flops and flip-flop recently, and now they're in a kind of more anti-Ukrainian place. Although that did switch recently and could switch again.
I read, I think on your website, that when you travel, you like to travel by foot. So I'm interested in what an average day or week might look like? How do you approach exploring a region by foot?
Oh, I wish that might be a little bit of an exaggeration. That makes me sound like my favorite traveler, Paddy Lee Fermer, and I love his books. And to like, I wish I actually
so do I.
walked across Eastern Europe. I try to do as much walking as I can and do on foot, but I do a lot of travel by bus, train, ferry. I like going overland, and I like doing long overland trips. I like feeling the kind of distance between places. To understand the history, you kind of have to understand that topography of things, and like the size of the forests and this like wide world of like just crossing plains, like being on the ground. So I like to do long kind of, especially for writing the book, I would usually start in Warsaw and then spend a few weeks or months, traveling from point to point to point to point. And then when I can, I like to wander around, especially kind of small towns, medium-sized cities, looking at used bookstores, little provincial museums, local churches, local shrines. I'm a big antique. I like looking for old postcards, antique fairs. I have this quest of looking for World War One cards, pre-World War One postcards, photo postcards from World War One. You can get in these, like small towns in Romania or Bulgaria. For dollars, just this incredible kind of views into people's lives, because you can translate what people wrote or just snapshots from World War One or World War Two, and you get a feel for kind of that depth of time and looking for things on the ground. Often with Google Maps, with local guides, local like little like town museums, provincial museums, and then I do like to. I grew up walking a lot in the Carpathians. My dad's a big hiker. He was going to Zakopane every summer with his dad. So mountain kind of hiking, not mountain climbing, but hiking is a favorite pursuit. But so a lot of that, I didn't make any huge overland journeys. I didn't kind of walk from country to country the way Paddy did in the 30s. That's a dream. And now the Via Carpathica has opened, or they're trying to open it, and the big kind of G8 Trans-Balkan route. I've done little sections of it here and there. I would love to spend a few months just kind of walking, either walking the Dinaric Alps or walking across. There's a St. John's route too, like the longer routes. I would love to do that, but I haven't really yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. Well, the last question I want to ask you, I like asking people how they choose their subtitles for their books. And I think an intimate history, that part of the subtitle is perhaps somewhat clear why you would choose that, but I'm interested in the word divided. An intimate history in a divided land. Could you tell me why you chose that as a subtitle?
I had a lot of trouble. I'll open the curtain a little bit. I had a lot of trouble with the subtitle and a lot of back and forth with my publisher and a lot of push and pull. So landing on it was a little bit of a compromise. There's the thought of doing a personal history, because I think it is kind of a personal history. I use my own stories, I use family stories kind of to illuminate parts of it. But I think actually I like intimate more, because the focus isn't on my family or my story, but it's on stories like my family. A lot of like small personal anecdotes of different people, of kind of everyday people or writers, not aristocrats, not rulers, not battles, but the experience of people. So that view is from the ground up, not from the top down. Divided Land was a struggle. I think it's all right. I think they're the kind, because it is, Eastern Europe is a slightly amorphous concept, but it is a world divided in multiple ways. Divided religiously between Catholic and Orthodox, between Jewish and Christian, between Muslim and Christian, kind of this meeting place of faith, this divide, multiple intersecting dividing lines, and now politically also, it's been a war zone multiple times over, and a kind of no man's land multiple times over. So I think that that conveys it. I was also constrained like Goodbye Eastern Europe. I kind of like that title, but it also puts Eastern Europe in it and says Europe, so I couldn't repeat those. And I was a little bit of a bind, and I wanted to divide it. Fractured land was a possibility. I thought that was a little too melodramatic, too kind of... People wrote about the Balkans in the 90s in a kind of heightened way and a kind of orientalizing way a little bit, and I thought like fractured was a little too much of that. Divided is a little more multivalent. You can see a lot of things because it's also the Berlin Wall. It's also, the Ottoman Habsburg division. You have like the Danube running through. You have a lot of multiple ways of seeing divided. It doesn't commit to a single one historically. But it's funny. You see a lot of euphemisms for Eastern Europe, like in the 80s. The other Europe was the totally standard one. There's a series of in America, actually a very good Philip Roth edited series of fiction from Eastern Europe that was called Fiction from the Other Europe. That's a hard one to use now, I think. But it meant something then, so it's a little delicate. But that's a great question. Yeah, that's something I struggled with.
There's also something I got from your work that it's something you called the gulf between official commemoration and deliberate forgetting. Does that have any relationship to this idea of divided, or is that something slightly different?
What I like about divided is that you can expand it to include lots of things, and I think that is a theme of the book too. Yeah. If you travel in Eastern Europe, you see this. There's this. Each country has the history it wants to tell, the kind of the official version that they work very hard to propagate. Nowhere harder than Poland or Hungary. A story that's told in monuments and museums and literature. And there's another story that is out there when you are on foot, when you're walking in the outskirts, being let to decay and crumble. Every country has other people's memories. This is a world that's become very homogenized through kind of historical tragedy. So Hungary, Budapest used to be a city with a huge Serbian minority and a big Greek minority. You would not know that. You have to really dig under the surface of Budapest to find that. Actually, an Armenian minority too. You can see a little bit of that. A big German minority too. It was a kind of a German town in the 1840s. That's just an example all over. You go to Transylvania, Romania, things are you see Romanian flag everywhere. It's Romania, 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 Romania. But it was Austro-Hungary. The people were mostly Hungarian recently. There are a lot of Hungarians still there. And that very insistent Romanianness is to say this is Romania now. What they're not saying is this used to be a very different type of place that was partly Hungarian, but also partly Jewish and Greek and Saxon and German, So there's that story that's hidden and the story that's visible. And that's true in basically every Eastern European country. It's also distinct. That's not true in the same way of, France or Italy or UK. It's what makes it kind of a really fascinating place to get in deep and go under the cover. If you go over, Slovakia, it's fascinating that way. Slovakia is just this mosaic of little enclaves, used to be all next to each other, and there are little bits of it left, and they're actually very good in the kind of the local museums and kind of highlighting that. But you won't necessarily know that just visiting Bratislava for a day.
But I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me and talk to me today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a dream of mine to visit Hokkaido. I've been to Japan only once, but all in the south. So one day I'd love to go where you are and say hello in person.
Yeah. Well, please let me know if you ever decide to come to Japan, and certainly Hokkaido.
I will, absolutely.
Be happy to show you around.
Thank you. All right.